Welcome everyone joining. Hopefully you can see the poll that's launched that's asking you what are you most hopeful for in the future. If you're happy to submit your answers, just interested to see what you're all looking forward to. I'm going to give it 30 seconds more just for everyone to be able to vote in the poll if you haven't. And please do introduce yourselves in the chat and how you first became involved with Restless Development. Just make sure it's set to send to all panelists and attendees so that hopefully everyone joining can see some familiar names. Okay, I'm going to end the poll now and share the results. So interesting that lots of people are excited about new voices and new leaders. Closer communities and local action, also a really popular one. A greener future, hugging friends, family, or even strangers. Not many on getting back to normal, which I think is really interesting. I wonder what normal will look like. Okay then, so I'm going to stop sharing those results now. And we'll get started. So thank you so much for joining everyone. Welcome. This is our final lunchtime webinar in the Becoming Restless Changing Development series. For anyone who doesn't know me yet, I'm Megan and I'm the Philanthropy Coordinator at Restless Development in our Philanthropy and Partnerships team. And I'm really excited to be hosting all of our excellent speakers we've had throughout the series. If you've missed either of the previous webinars, you can catch up on the recordings and more content from our speakers on our Becoming Restless webpage, which I'll share following today's webinar. We're holding these webinars as this year marks 10 years since we became Restless Development, having been Student Partnerships Worldwide, or SPW, since 1985 before that. So in celebration, our leaders and supporters are sharing the journey we've been on to do development differently, with insights into our work and the future of Restless Development, all in the hopes of inspiring you all joining to be part of our journey going forward as a supporter if you'd like to. Please do write the questions that you've got in the Q&A function throughout the webinar. This is separate to the chat just so that me and Perry can see them as we go along. And then we'll answer as many of them as possible during our optional Q&A session at 1:30 GMT. So I'm really excited to introduce today's speaker, Perry Maddox, who many of you will already know as the CEO of Restless Development. Perry champions youth leadership and multiplies it through his approach to distributing power throughout Restless's organisational culture and also through his blog, Just Open Leaders. So it's my pleasure to introduce Perry today to share Restless's evolution so far and the future of the organisation. Thank you, Perry.
Oh, happy. Thanks, Megan. And lovely to see so many of you, so many names that I know from across the Restless journey. Yeah, joining. So it's such a pleasure to be with you. It is this morning. I'm calling in from the States. And I wanted to start with my story, actually. Nearly 12 years ago, I joined SPW to lead our work in Uganda. And I was asking myself, why did I do that? I did it for 3 reasons. One, because I saw this organization and it was driven by volunteers. And I think that's really powerful. I think that's really important. The second is I got this kind of vibe from this group of this kind of can-do, no pretense, make things happen the right way attitude. And I just loved it. You know, I didn't stand on ceremony, they just got it done. And most importantly, most of the volunteers were national. And now there were some kind of international volunteers who came from other countries to work, but most of these volunteers were national. And unlike most organizations out there where the international volunteer or the white expat or the kind of foreign person leads the story, this organization was different. It was locally led, it was values driven, it was high impact. And what I love about what you just said in the poll was the 2 things that you said were most hopeful about, the new voices and leaders and closer communities, was exactly what attracted me to SPW 12 years ago, and it still keeps me here. So after a really tearfully embarrassing goodbye to my girlfriend in Paraguay, I got on a plane and moved to Uganda. Don't worry, we kept it together. We're married and she'll probably walk in with the baby here in a little bit. And I started in Uganda. 2 years later, we became Restless Development. not to change who we were, but to better tell our story about what we're all about the restless passion, enthusiasm, can do, make it happen now, power of young people and communities to create change and what mattered to them. And the development, the cold hard results, the value for money, the making every single pound count to get a better result, to outperform other organizations. Not because we're competitive, because we had to prove that young people can get results. And so that kind of restless development was all the fire, all the passion, all the belief and trust in young people, and all the performance, all the cold, hard delivery to prove that that's the right way to lead change. So we changed our name that day, but it wasn't the only thing we changed as an organization. We changed a lot, and in some ways, nothing. We still centered on young people in rural communities, teaching health education and life skills in schools, working with farmers and fields to increase crop yields, connecting communities across health clinics, police stations, local government, the football field, the youth resource center, grassroots, gritty change. That's still happening today. We just kept doing that, and we did more. And at the same time, a lot changed when we became Restless Development, because we asked a bigger question. We said, how do we not just reach the couple hundred thousands of people we reach in rural communities? How do we serve the 3.8 billion people under 30? Now, you don't deliver programs to 3.8 billion people. So we asked ourselves, how do we support? How do we help on a bigger scale? And the answer is obvious. You don't do that alone, right? So we became, and we worked to become a go-to for the biggest development partners and the biggest governments in the world. And we basically walked into their offices and said, how can we help? The majority of your population is under 30. How can we help? What are you worried about? Are you worried about conflict? Are you worried about agricultural yields? Are you worried about peaceful transitions for conflict? We're here to help, because the majority of people in that community are young, and the majority of talent that you can tap into is young. So what we started doing is taking all that delivery work that we've always done, and we used it to distill insight, research, evidence, training, tools that we would use to influence, to advocate, and to skill up the biggest governments in the world. I'm talking about the United Nations. I'm talking about the US government, the UK government. I'm talking about the Constitution of Tanzania, the budgeting in India. Okay, this is not just, these are global governments, helping them to work better, to do what they wanted to do already because they worked with youth. Sometimes that meant we had to convince them, and sometimes that meant we just had to help them. And so we taught them how to understand and listen to young people, right? How to better serve the needs of young people. But most importantly, we taught them how to work with young people to get better results, right? There's your solution. There's your scale. Half the community is young. If you can work with those people not to receive change, but to lead change, well, that's how we change a lot of things really quickly. And that's what we've been doing for the last 12 years or 10 years as Restless Development. And whether or not that was driving Ebola to zero in Sierra Leone, responding to the earthquakes in Nepal, supporting young people to start over 10,000 businesses across Africa and Asia, or shaping the strategy of the UN, the UK government, Tanzania and India. At the same time, young people on the ground in communities, ending child marriage in whole districts in Nepal, fighting discrimination and corruption nationwide in Sierra Leone, and helping young mothers get back into school so they can continue their education. And as you start to think about it, it sounds like a lot, and it is a lot. And whether or not those young people were volunteer peer educators, like many of you started with us back in the day, leading good programs in rural communities, or researchers, or advocates, or community mobilizers, or youth reporters, data monitors, entrepreneurs, corporate partners, teachers, no matter how they did it, we have always been about one thing: young leaders. Those are just different ways of leading. Restless Development is about one thing: young leaders. We don't do charity, we do change. And the way we do change is by working with young people to drive the solutions to the biggest problems out there. And a lot does need to change. So Megan's going to pop up a poll to get a sense of what you think needs to change.
10 more seconds for the few of you that haven't voted. Okay.
Really interesting on the poll results. When we started, when we created our current global strategy, we did it, well, we didn't, young people did it. Young people led a 50-odd country consultation, bringing in voices from around the world, asking what issues mattered most. And the top one that came out from young people 5 years ago was basically inequality and governance. Climate was hot on the heels. And the interesting thing about all of those options is those are the very options that young people are working on with Restless Development today. From fighting climate breakdown, to fighting for the rights of women, to challenging systemic racism around the world. That's what young people do with Restless Development. They might do it as volunteers, they might do it as researchers, but young people are taking on the biggest challenges in the world, and they're choosing the ones that we take on. CEO of Restless Development doesn't set strategy. I serve young leaders, right? And they said that's what matters most. And that's what we're going to be working on. Those kind of topics are where we're going to be working for the next 10 years. And as we look forward to the next 10 years as Restless Development, and no, we're not going to change our name again. We like this one. It tells our story well, I think. I think we're going to do three things. I want us to do three things. I know we will achieve three things. First and foremost, we're going to continue to multiply young leaders. We're going to continue to support young leaders to lead change in communities around the world as our core business and our core offer to the world. The difference is we're going to ask those young leaders to multiply other young leaders. They've already done it. This is kind of what we do, but we're going to really hone down on our core offer and our core mojo, right? That moment where a young leader reaches out to another young person in a community or in a corridor of power or in a corporate organization or partner or in government, and they take that other young leader on a journey for good, a journey for change, a journey for power, right? Mobilizing communities, bringing people together to rise to the biggest challenges ever. And the way we're doing that now is through an initiative we're calling Restless Leaders. And in effect, what Restless Leaders is bottling the secret sauce. For the last 35 years, we have been excellent at training and supporting young leaders to lead change in communities, to lead programs, and to create outcomes. And part of our challenge is, well, if somebody asks us, can you give us that model? We can say, well, we can send you the staff who can do it. We've got people who know how to do it. But if somebody wants to run Restless's work halfway around the world where we don't have people, we need a model. We need a training tool so that they can take that and they can use it for free. Okay, this is not about us making money. This is about creating bigger change in the world. And if you are uncertain, let me tell you two numbers that just came out of our most recent volunteer survey. We surveyed 3,000 volunteers who led our work last year. 99% of them said they were proud to work for Restless Development. 99% of 3,000 people. And I think more excitingly, 97 said they got very good training. Now, I've been working volunteers my whole career. You don't ever get 97% happy with training. You don't tend to get 97% happy with anything in life. What we want to do is take that core offer of how you train young leaders and support young leaders to go out and unleash not 2, not 3, not 5, 200 young leaders in a community, 500 leaders across youth sector, across the world, right? So we're going to keep multiplying young leaders as our core identity ethos and our core value that we offer to the world, right? Because the world needs more young leaders who can mobilize those 3.8 billion, right? So that's one. The second thing we're going to do is continue to unleash youth power for global change. Youth power at a time where our world needs it the most. Because you could look at those 3.8 billion young people out there and say, well, those are beneficiaries to be served or to be reached. I think that's a terribly wasteful and condescending approach. I see those 3.8 billion young people as the biggest chance we have to change this world, to rise to the challenge of climate breakdown, to fight misinformation online, to help governments to better serve their people, to get better results, right? I see youth power as a solution. So what we're going to do is work with, currently, we're working with over 1,000 youth organizations in 74 countries. These are good youth-led organizations, movements, networks, groups, and what we're helping them to do is do their work better. We're not telling them what to do, they're the experts, thank you very much. We're helping them to run their organizations better, to staff better, to develop leaders better, to fundraise better, to advocate better, to deliver better work. but we're also helping them to come together, because these are relatively small and dispersed organizations. They can't get in the door at the UN, but we can, and we can bring all 1,000 of them in there with us. So that's what we're doing, right? It's not about choosing the message. They get to choose when they get to the door, to the table, right? But we leverage the collective youth power to open the door to the biggest conversations in the world and to get in there and say, how can we help, right? Because that's what the UN, that's what the UK, that's what every government in the world needs. They need their citizens walking the door saying, we're ready to help, thank you. And we're also ready to speak truth, and we're ready to challenge you if you're not doing things the right way, all right? We're not deferential, right? We're gonna come in there and we're gonna help them make a better outcome for everyone. So youth power, right? Youth collectively organizing for a bigger outcome. And third, we're gonna help those power holders of the world to work better with youth. We're not just gonna tell them what to do, we're gonna take them by the shoulder and say, hey, we can help you, right? We can help you, we can teach you how to learn. We can teach you how to listen. We can teach you how to create change through young people. Who better? That's what we've been doing for 35 years. We can teach you to be a little bit restless, right? Because you're gonna need that restless energy if you're gonna rise to the development challenges of our day. You know, we can't even solve COVID as a global, set of organizations. What do you think we're gonna do with climate? Something's gotta change. We're not gonna build back better. Anybody who's talking about building back has forgotten that the thing before is what led to the situation. We need to build back differently. And the only way we're gonna do that is by both bringing young people to the table as full equal partners, but also training people in power on how to get the best from this youth power, right? And to do that, we're gonna start bottling that secret sauce with something called the youth power principles. And that is effectively, we're gonna develop a tool of what we believe, what we know, and what we can evidence works best in this world, and offer that again for free to anybody in the world who wants to work with young people. So those are the three things we're gonna do. We're gonna multiply young leaders, we're gonna unleash youth power, we're gonna work with power holders to better work with youth, right? To scale the impact that young people have in this world when we need it most. And just so you know, along the way as Restless Development, we're gonna keep asking ourselves hard questions. If y'all know me, you know why I ask a hard question about how do we walk the walk? Let's be really honest. How do we practice our values? How do we, not just win awards for transparency and culture, good for us, right? How do we look at that award and go, that's out of date? Because the next thing we're gonna do is so much more ambitious. It's so much more humble. It's so much more youth and community led that everything's gotta change, right? Because we also wanna show the world how charities, how nonprofits, how communities work. So there you go. We're gonna multiply youth leadership. We're gonna unleash youth power. We're gonna help power holders work with youth. And we're gonna hold up a mirror to ourselves and continue to grow and to evolve and to be humble as Restless Development. But we won't do it alone. I think if 2020 has taught us anything is that we have to be in this fight together. And it's also taught us that we're not equally effective. Corona has not been a great leveler. It has made just, inequality worse. But the solution comes when we're all in it together, right? To fight together for, to end COVID, to fight racism, just for a better world. Because the challenges aren't going to stop coming at us. If you're easy to change the world, somebody would have done it already. Okay, we need to rise to this together. And just like that young volunteer peer educator who gets up the crack of dawn in a rural community in Uganda, and I know him because I trained him, and who gets on a bicycle and who pedals for an hour out to a rural school, and teaches for a whole day, giving her time, her talent, her energy, right? We couldn't do it without her. And we couldn't do it without our supporters either. The people who give their time, their talent, their energy to help us make this happen. Because you don't mobilize 3.8 billion people on your own. You don't mobilize a couple 100,000 on your own. You do it in partnership. And we are so thankful for you who are our partners, because we look out there and we see half the world under 30. And we know that our ability as a world to rise to the challenges of our day depends on that half of the world. And let me be really honest, our ability at Restless Development to serve that group depends on your support. So thank you so much for the support you've given us, for the time, for the talent, for the resource. And if you'd consider continuing to support us, well, of course, we'd love that too. I will stop talking at you now, and I'd be happy to take some Q&A later. Thank y'all.
Thank you, Perry. We'll move on to our Q&A in a moment for everyone who's able to stay. So please do put your questions for Perry in the Q&A box. But today is Giving Tuesday, a day where people all around the world are coming together in unity and kindness by giving to something they really believe in. So we'd like to ask you today to be part of this and support the next chapter of our journey, the future that Perry was talking about. There are lots of ways that you can support what we do, but today we'd really love you to consider supporting us personally with a monthly donation at restlessdevelopment.org/donate. We can help we can help the biggest youth generation of our time to tackle the greatest challenges our world faces together with your support. You can also get in touch with me at megan@restlessdevelopment.org if you're interested in discussing partnering with us. And thank you so much, as Perry said, to our existing partners for being part of this already. We really do appreciate it. So now let's move on to the Q&A section of the webinar for those that are able to stay on. We've reached this part a little bit ahead of schedule, so we've got plenty of time for your questions, but we know that some people will have to dash off at 1:30. So thank you very much to those people for joining us so far. So I'm just going to have a look in the Q&A box and pull out some questions. Okay, so we've got a question from Vanessa saying, great to hear your thoughts. One of the priorities you mentioned is helping people in power work better with youth. Can you give more details on what that means in practice and who specifically are the power holders you work with, i.e. local or national government actors, corporate leaders, and so on?
Brilliant question. Let me start with who first, and then we'll kind of describe how. This starts at the local level. You know, and I think one of the big things that people who've been with Restless for years will know is that we don't, our young leaders don't just kind of run programs in communities. They spend time in the health clinic, they spend time at the local government office, you know, in a community. And they listen and learn. And then they begin to work with those kind of community leaders to understand how they can better engage youth and better learn from youth. So it happens at a local level, but we very much do this at a national level. So it depends on each country, because each country has a kind of a different approach. But very often we are working with the government of, you know, the government of Nepal. We have 2 young people embedded inside the one of the ministries in Nepal full time. And what their job is to advise that ministry on how best to gather insight, how best to design programs that serve young people, how best to partner with young people, how best to get youth voice to the table, the whole kind of thing. Whereas you skip over to, a different country, Tanzania, we have worked with the government of Tanzania to mobilize 260,000 young people to feed into the constitution review process that happened, like, I think 3, 4, 5 years ago, somewhere in that kind of space. So we engage national government a lot, and we obviously engage kind of global actors. I had a lovely kind of conversation with a senior leader in the UN, extremely senior leader in the UN. And she said, kind of leaned over and said, if it hadn't been for Restless Development and 2 other organizations, so it's not just us, young people would not have showed up in the Sustainable Development Goal process. And those are the 15-year goals that guide, most global development investment around the world. And so we work at that level too. We work with donors. You better believe we work with donors, like the Gates Foundation, like Ford, like Rockefeller, like the UK government. We work with people who send money because, what, like it or not, people who send money have power, and we influence them on how best to invest in youth. Sometimes we do that through kind of just saying, you need to invest in youth. And sometimes we say, here's the cutting edge research on what works in youth-led civil society. If you invest this way, you get this outcome. If you work with young people this way, you're going to achieve that kind of change in the world. That doesn't work, by the way. And so that's the feel of how we work. We usually work much more in partnership rather than kind of against the government and kind of challenging, but you better believe we challenge when we're in the room. And how does it actually work in practice? This is as long as a ball of string, but I often explain it. There are kind of 5 levels, I think, of youth-led change in the world. One is kind of training young people to lead change, right? That's kind of the lowest level in a way, right? And that's where most organizations start. They go, oh, we want to train young people, right? Okay, that's all right. Some training support is needed, right? The second is where we kind of partner with young people, where young people lead work with us, right? So young people lead our volunteer programs as Restless Development. The third is where young people lead their own work. So kind of youth-led organizations, youth collective, youth networks, right? Not dependent on a government or a donor or an organization, but young people out there just organizing, getting it done by themselves. Like the mock COP that's happening right now. So there's a youth-led kind of process feeding into the COP process on climate in the UK, right? Then you have youth voice, where young people are both influencing decision-making, but also holding it to account. And then you have the highest level is kind of youth governance, where young people are on the board, thank you, and in the leadership space. And what we do is we work with these governments and donors, and we assess where they are. Some of these folks are super progressive, and they're already up here really interested in youth voice. They see young people as equals, and they want them in the room. And so we're helping them to do that a little bit better. Some of these folks just want to train the young people, okay, which is not terribly transformative, but we work with them. We help them do that better. Okay, if your goal as an education, as the Ministry of Education for Zambia, where we've been working for 20, 30 years, is to train more young teachers and to do it better, we're happy to do that, right? And as we build that relationship, we start to move you up the dial, right? And so what happened in Zambia is they were having a trouble with teacher attrition due to HIV. They have these teacher training colleges that are nationwide, and they were unfortunately kind of spreading HIV at a very high rate, in the same way that you often have when you have mobile populations. When you take somebody from one community and move them to another kind of region, that's how outbreaks spread, unfortunately. And the Ministry of Education had trouble with this. They couldn't keep teachers healthy, and the teachers weren't confident teaching HIV education when they went out nationwide after the training. So based on that kind of partnership we had with them, training young leaders, we started training teachers, right? And those teachers started going nationwide. Not we, the same young leaders went into teacher training colleges and started training those teachers so they could go nationwide. 5 years later, 98% of those teachers were still teaching the curriculum. It's pretty amazing. But we didn't stop there. We started to work with an independent radio station, and we created a radio program called Tikambe, which is really hardcore policy level analysis. And it's a radio station that brings youth voice alongside kind of healthcare workers and alongside frontline teachers. And they sit and have these kind of radio chats about topics like teen pregnancy, gender-based violence, HIV, health issues that affect the education system. And this radio show runs right at the time when the parliamentarians get off. So they clock off, get in the cars, and what are they listening to? Well, hopefully Tikambe radio. That's been running for 10 years, and it's creating big, big change. And then what do? We go, well, how can we get some young people into that ministry, thanks, so that they can hold you to account and lead this together? I mean, that's one story, but that kind of gives you the sense of how we work across that spectrum. It's different in every group, but our core mojo is not the UN, it is the local government. It always has been and always will be.
Thanks, Perry, and thanks, Vanessa, for your question. We've got a question from Charlotte saying, following on from the announcement that the government plans to reduce its expenditure on the international aid budget, how will this cut affect Restless Development's work, the young leaders and the communities? So I think this is referring to the announcement in the spending review last week that the aid budget is at risk of going from 0.7% to 0.5% for the year.
Well, it's going to hurt. I mean, it's going to hurt. I mean, that's a significant budget cut to anybody working in the international development space that's been working with the UK government. And the UK government has been our biggest partner over the last decade. So, look, it's painful. It is disappointing to see it happen. We have to ask ourselves how we do more with less, how we adapt, how we look at that and not mourn the loss, but retain the opportunity. And we say, what do we do? What can we achieve with the resources that we have? Restless Development's core spirit is a lean, dirt on your boots kind of organization that gets out there and gets it done. And that's what we're going to keep doing, right? At the same time, we're going to have to cut the scale of our ambition because you can't spend money you don't have. And the last thing we're going to do is be fiscally responsible. So we hope over time to grow that kind of support in other areas. And we will kind of diversify our approach around the world. We don't want to be too dependent on one country. And the greater we can grow our supporter base, and really honestly, I think the greater we can grow our supporter base in the business community, to not be dependent on the kind of political whims and fluctuations that will always happen with any government in the world, the more independent we will be and the more able we'll be to sustain kind of big impact over change. And I think that goes to the question that Charlotte, you also asked about Brexit. It's the same. These are bigger barriers to our work, less resources, and we're going to innovate like crazy. We're going to hopefully develop more partners who will invest in a different way and allow us to achieve impact over time.
Thanks, Perry. Okay, there's a question from Louise saying, can you share more detail about the tool you referred to and how you're going about developing that?
So I kind of referenced two tools. I think this is the Restless Leaders one. Is that the kind of, I'll start with the Restless Leaders one. So Restless Leaders is effectively the kind of exercise of packaging what we do best so that we can do it at a greater scale and offer it to other partners. How do we train, how do we identify, select, train, support, nourish young leaders to lead change through our programs, but also in our staffing? Because guess what, I think 98% of our staff are proud to work with us. You know, no, 99% are proud, 98% trust global leadership, you know, so they tolerate me. It works in staffing, it also works in volunteer models. And what we've done is we started an initiative earlier this year to build that model. And what we did is we did an intensive training of trainers, in effect, of 20 diverse leaders from around the world. I personally led this training because I think it's that important. And we had in the room a CEO, we had two young board members from around the world. We had the most junior level, we have an officer from one of our countries, and we had everybody in between. So a hyper diverse group of, you know, across countries of origin, across race, across gender, all the right mix of Restless. And what we did is we built together a participatory approach to basically distill how this works into something that we can package and scale up. So they have done the initial round of consultations. They're working in each country with different kind of groups to package up what makes a restless leader. And then we're going to apply the best of effectively experiential learning theory and experiential training to build up an experiential learning program. So that when you join Restless as a staff member, you start your Restless Leaders journey, and it takes X amount of time, and you develop these kind of skills so that you'll be a better staff member, a better leader. The same thing we can offer to volunteers. The same thing we can offer to our corporate partners, the same thing we can offer to the government of Uganda. It's been slowed by COVID, this kind of design process, but it's moving along well, and I imagine we'll kind of get into a prototype early next year, and then we'll run that. It's being driven by young people, as it must, and we're going to field test that until we're comfortable that it's the quality it needs to be. The youth power principles, similar approach. It will be a similar approach. We'll start by working with young leaders around that kind of youth collective to define what they believe you know, those power principles are, and then we're going to come back and make sure that there's evidence behind all that. And I think that's a really healthy thing in our sector to go, what do we believe, right? But what can we also prove? And if we can't prove it, it doesn't mean it's not true. It just means we might have a little gap and we need to put some research there so that we can back it up. And we're not going to publish those principles until we're confident they're absolutely true. Because we want this to be a standard for the sector that says, if you want to work with young people the right way, this is how. And here's the research behind it.
Thanks, Carrie. So there's a question from Carrie. How else can small UK-based businesses support Restless Development in addition to donations and fundraising? Thank you, Carrie. And I would say that donations and fundraising is always welcome as well.
Well, thanks, Carrie. Carrie works with IP Integration, one of our great kind of corporate partners in the UK. And we've always loved working with IPI. And I think, look, skills matter a lot. I'm really proud of our team. I think we're as talented as anybody out there, and I think we probably get more impact per pound than most. Well, I know we do. But we are not deeply staffed. We don't have the kind of war chests that most corporates have, even small businesses. And so we won't carry all the kind of staffing that many organizations will. We won't carry too many people in design, or we won't carry tons of people in data and analytics. You know, we are starved for analytic talent in our organization, despite the level of data we generate. You know, we have really exceptional communications professionals and comms folks who run stuff around the world, but they can only do as much as one person can do in a day. And I think the skill-based volunteering that we have used with kind of corporate partners over the years has been amazing. I know it's been amazing. We won 7 nationwide awards for best CSR partnership in the UK for a 5-year partnership that we had with KPMG, doing exactly this. And they would give us their best talent for 2-3 week intervals, or maybe they'd work with us over a 6-month period, you know, a day here or there, to help us advance the biggest processes that we wanted to advance as Restless Development, to improve our efficiency, to improve our outcomes, to manage our money, to roll out IT systems, you name it. We've got a team of lawyers right now from KPMG who's helping us to work out our global license agreements, which is really boring, but you need that if you work across 10 different countries where the legal frameworks are changing every day. And you better believe we don't have that in-house legal talent to solve that. So that kind of skill-based volunteering is awesome. It really transforms us. And the other thing is just talking about us. You know, Restless Development, we don't have a big, I don't even know if we have a PR budget. You know, a lot of people don't know who we are, and that's okay. We don't need to be known, but the more people do know who we are, the more people talk about it, just at the pub when we're allowed to go back to the pub and just say, hey, look, those folks are great. That helps us a lot. And finally, feel free to just reach out to our team and say, hey, you're doing a great job, because they work their tails off to make all this happen. And I think those kind of personal connections is what keeps us going. And I'd like to think in these corporate partnerships that everything you just said, or I just said, you get back. My kind of view on corporate partnerships is if you don't get as much back from maturity as you give, then you should walk away in terms of staff satisfaction, morale, engagement, and learning. Because we can be mentored, but we also can do some good reverse mentoring, and then we see that as an equal partnership.
Thanks, Perry. Yes, as Perry mentioned, Carrie is one of our corporate partners at IPI and has been to visit our work. And I hope that Carrie would feel that it's a very mutually beneficial relationship, and we don't do transactional corporate partnerships. They are built together and beneficial on all sides. And we're very grateful for everything that Carrie does to support that partnership. So thank you as well for your question. Okay, so there's a question from Johnny saying, COVID has given an excuse for some governments to clamp down on the work of civil society and dissenting views. Has that impacted the work of restless activists?
Absolutely. And it happened before COVID. We have had severe security threats against young leaders at times from, I can't say governments, but kind of government actors who didn't like us talking about accountability, who didn't like us, speaking about performance of government. And we have to be really careful. Let me be really clear here. The first thing that matters is safety. No amount of political change is worth a young person getting hurt or getting harmed or losing their life. Okay, and so we have really rigorous and really boring safety protocols, and we don't start any work in the activist space without making really sure that we understand the risk, that we can mitigate as much of that risk as possible, and if there's any residual risk, that we go in eyes wide open. We know how to monitor and how to kind of protect everybody as we go. We have pulled work within hours when we've seen that kind of risk, and we will always put the safety of activists first. One of the biggest ways we mitigate this, though, is we work with governments. We're not affiliated with any party in any country where we work. We work with governments, not parties, and I think that helps us. And we generally try to work in a way that says, how can we help? Now, sometimes in different kind of contexts, we can't do the level of work that we might do in different countries. And that's frustrating. And we have some really hard, values-heavy conversations. I mean, some of the toughest conversations I've been in Restless Development is when we're saying, hey, look, we want to take a global stance on X issue, but if we do that, we could get our team thrown in jail in that country. And what do? We just get in a room, we work it out. We have, rigorous frameworks, so it's not a subjective decision. And again, we prioritize the safety of our people first. And if we take risk, then we do it in kind of full agreement with everybody. We manage that risk as best we can. And you want to do all that without dampening the activism and the voice. And so that's one of those kind of inherent tensions in our work. How do you challenge and also engage? And sometimes we can be more challenging, a little bit more punching, a little bit more front foot. And sometimes we got to extend a hand and kind of pull those kind of political actors into the middle. One of the best ways to also do that is we work in partnership. We work in consortia. We work on campaigns with other organizations, and we take safety in numbers where we can.
Thank you. So we've got a question from Lewis, who is a Restless ICS alumni from 2017 and 2018, who asks, what do you think the largest challenges are for small local-led development organizations with regards to sustainability and achieving impact at scale?
Well, I mean, I think in some ways the question of scale is the problem, and I think we have to be careful. Restless has to be careful. We're not so big. We're not a small local organization, but we're not a gigantic organization. And I think sometimes if you go chasing scale, you can tilt at windmills. And I think what we do with these kind of 1,000 youth-led local organizations, we work on them to understand, what's the impact and the need that only you can create, right? And how do we help you to do that incredibly well? And we kind of counsel those folks to start there and just to really master the deep quality of what they're doing. And to master the kind of almost relentless and ruthless focus on the one thing that matters most rather than the hundreds of things. Because Restless, we're at our worst where we diversify too much and get stretched in too many directions, and we're at our best when we go, this is about young leaders. And I think that probably applies to most local organizations, at least the ones I've led and worked with. I think sustainability is scale, I think scale within a community, scale within a region, yes. And, if we're talking about kind of national, regional scale, I think that's where consortium and partners and kind of collaboration and comes together, because those voices joined up can create formidable scale and skill. And that's what we've been doing, for years in terms of helping local organizations to influence nationally and regionally. I think the question around sustainability is much uglier. The biggest barrier to local-led organizations being sustainable are international organizations, right? Who take a lot of the money involved in development and pass that on, and they subgrant down to local organizations. And they usually subgrant and say, well, you can only spend X amount on your overhead, while taking a bigger overhead themselves. And this is a real issue in our sector. We see big organizations, big NGOs are actually putting small organizations out of work because they're just taking too much of the pie. And so and that's a sad reality, and it comes for good reasons, right? Because donors invest in these big organizations to protect against risk, right? Small organizations are riskier. That's true. What we're doing is we've just this year we've led a whole piece of youth-led research into the state of youth-led civil society. So what is the reality for those youth organizations? They identified 5 kind of key factors behind the fragility of youth civil society, and then they created a whole kind of power pack on how you can invest in, solve. And there's all kinds of ways here, from leadership development and training to power shifting philanthropy, which is basically when you invest directly or you invest in, kind of organizations who don't take a big overhead. And we are using those findings to influence the way donors around the world work. And you better believe it. I've been at the Gates Foundation twice in the last 2 years, sharing that research and encouraging them to invest in a different way. We work the same way with the UK government because, everybody's got a role to play. I'm not against international organizations, but I think, we need to be a little bit more humble about who actually leads change in this world, and therefore, how do we facilitate that rather than lead it from the top down?
Thank you, Lewis, for your question and for your answer, Perry. Okay, so we've got a question from Graham, who says, congratulations for the great work over the decade. Proud to be a supporter. Thank you very much, Graham. And thank you for your support. How do you intend to get the young into the climate change debate, in particular over the very hard issue of energy poverty? For example, should Mozambique be able to develop its natural gas reserves to provide load power during a transition?
Good. I don't have an educated view on that kind of question on gas reserves, Graham, but I joke. Graham's one of our longtime supporters and always, brilliant kind of development mind. The issue here is not necessarily the answer. It's not for me to answer, right? That's not my role. What we can do, however, is, and how we intend to do this, is work with the youth organizations working in Mozambique. We do support youth organizations in that area, and understand if they're engaged in climate, are they able to are they able to have those kind of conversations? Are they able to answer that kind of question? I suspect they probably are able to answer the question. And I suspect that probably they're struggling to know whom to talk to. Do I go to the Ministry of Energy, or do I go to the kind of, the businesses that are in that kind of space? And where we come in is we support those young people to be ready when they get into the room, right? To craft their message, to talk about their techniques. How do you land a message powerfully? How do you help a government actor? How do you tell them what they need, information the way they need to hear it? And we'll also sit down with that government or kind of corporate partner and say, how do you ask the best questions? How do you best listen? And how do we create a kind of partnership? We very much understand ourselves as conveners. And I think in countries where we don't work and in topics that are way over our heads, technically, convening will be really important. And in the meantime, at a global level, we are partnering with all kinds of organizations like the Count Us In campaign. Count Us In has worked out that 60% of global emissions could be reduced through individual actions. Now, we have systemic change to achieve by all means, especially in the extractive industry, right? And this is not about putting the onus of climate change on people, but it's also about empowering people to go that this is not hopeless. And if we individually take action, that adds up to a whole lot. And so we continue to work in that kind of space, more kind of specifically on climate. while kind of leaning our traditional convening, youth capacity building, government engaging approach in more kind of technical climate questions.
Thank you very much, Perry. I think we've got time, well, we're over time now, but for those that are able to stay on, we'll just take 2 more questions. So Giancarlo has asked, Perry, what do you think was the biggest lesson learned during these last 10 years, your aha moment that made you change some of your approaches or activities?
Oh, good. Well, you probably remember this one, John. It was, for me, it was the Sierra Leone Ebola outbreak. And, you know, quickly, this is the worst Ebola outbreak in history. Sierra Leone and West African region had never experienced, I think, an Ebola outbreak, or at least one not of this scale. And what happened in the Sierra Leonean context was really instructive for us in terms of where we needed to go as an agency. In the early days of the outbreak, most of the NGOs shut their doors because it was a scary thing. Nobody knew what was happening. Everybody closed up. At that point, we had volunteers in the field doing work. So we brought them in, retrained them to try to understand what was happening in communities. They generated some really powerful insight. I remember sitting in a government office in Freetown with a UN leader, and he was saying, this isn't going to be a big deal. And I said, no, this is a huge deal. You know, look at the information that we're pulling off of kind of grassroots communities. You know, fast forward, you know, a month later, and our country director was in a room with all the kind of development actors in Freetown, and they said, does anybody have people in the field, right, in the communities? And a couple hands went up, and they said, no, does anybody actually have people in the communities now? And the only hand still raised was our country director in Sierra Leone, and he said, we've got 1,000 young people deployed across all those regions, ready to go now. And they started their work, right? But the early day, at the same time, the government and kind of UN interventions were pushing kind of a one-way message. Because Ebola had never happened in Sierra Leone, people didn't know what it was. And so what was happening from the kind of the big actors of the world, the big money of the world was coming in and pushing these messaging campaigns that said, Ebola is real and Ebola will kill you. That's literally the core messaging sheet, and they were screaming this through megaphones off the back of trucks. That's not great. You know, that just scared people. And what it did is it took behavior and people hid behavior. Because to change Ebola, to fight Ebola, you have to not care for your sick or dying relative. You can't touch them. You have to self-report when you have malaria-like symptoms to an Ebola treatment center. Nobody wants to walk into there. You have to invite some guy in a hazmat suit into your community to bury your loved ones, right? These are massive things to do. And if somebody's screaming Ebola will kill you off the back of a truck, is not going to encourage you to do that. It's actually going to had the inverse impact. It created more Ebola spreading behavior. Right? The initial response to development communities to tell these communities what to do made it worse. Whereas the work we started doing early on, and it wasn't just Restless Development, right? But the work we started doing, because it was embedded in communities, we rolled out an early stage Ebola education program. And it wasn't screaming messaging at anybody, right? But it was still delivering messages about what Ebola was. And it was largely effective, but it wasn't necessarily transformative. That was a little pilot program. We learned from that pilot when we debriefed with the young leaders who were leading it, what was working and what wasn't. And we created a new program, which was the Community-Led Ebola Action Program. And this is a model that's all about community triggering. So rather than telling communities what to do, these young leaders would go into communities and spend, 6, 7 visits working with communities to understand what communities saw as a problem, to ask them the questions, to kind of trigger communities to create their own action plans. And once they did, 98% of those action plans were running 6 months later. Once communities took control of this, the infection rate plummeted. There are 3 PhDs at the Gates Foundation studying the data set that we created through a nationwide program that served 60% of that population in Sierra Leone. And the big aha moment was, this is all about communities. It's not necessarily just about young people, it's about young people mobilizing communities. And nowadays in Restless, you hear that almost everywhere. Young people tell us this, we don't want this. This is not youth for youth. We want youth for issues. We want youth working with communities. And I think that was a big moment for us in terms of how we run our programs in communities, but also how we think about how we collectively organize. It's not just about youth. It's kind of youth saying, how can we help? And youth being the most dynamic, the most willing to volunteer, the ones willing to put their hands up and go back to the front lines to volunteer when others were afraid. Not youth for youth, but youth engaging, mobilizing, creating change, multiplying leaders far bigger than themselves.
Thank you for that answer. I think we've only got time for one more really before we should wrap up. So I think a nice one to end on. Somebody said, Happy Giving Tuesday. As you mentioned, today is a day for people to come together globally and support the causes that mean a lot to them. Why would you encourage people to back youth leadership this year?
I would always encourage people to back youth leadership. Why this year? I mean, I think, just go back to the raw numbers of it. There's two arguments here. One is that half the world is under 30. So they're either young now or in the next 10 years, they're going to go from being children to young. If you work with that group now, you create a scaled change that is almost, the only other group that can offer that is women, in effect, who make up half the world. Sorry, men, we've had our time. You know, I think, we of course work with people of all genders, but you know, if you want to invest for transformative scale, young people offer a really unique opportunity, scale opportunity. They make up the majority of almost every community in the developing world. You know, entrepreneurs, unemployed, sadly, refugees, combatants, people, you know, people of all stripes. The majority of that community is usually young, and so both to create change through those young people, but also to gather their insight to shape bigger investment, to shape government policy, to shape the way the world works, youth offer the most scale in the world. They also happen to be, and this is proven, it's not just me talking, more disposed to take civic action, more technologically connected, more inclined to volunteer, you know, they're at a stage of their life where they tend to have fewer kind of entangling responsibilities, right? And they are able to kind of stretch and to grow. And if we need to grow solutions in the world, why not invest in the people who are built for growth? And so that's why I think youth are really important. And you can see it in COVID. You can see it in COVID, you can see it in the good and the bad. You know, young people have been both demonized in COVID, and also they have been front line of kind of tracking misinformation and holding Facebook and Twitter and all those kind of folks to account for letting misinformation and anti-vaxxing messaging and all that kind of stuff go unchecked. Young people go into that breach. Young people go into the breach of the Ebola, and they're willing to volunteer and to take action. And they happen to be half the world, and they happen to be really good at it.
I think that's a lovely place to leave it. Sorry that we weren't able to get to everyone's questions, but thank you so much. I think we can follow up afterwards, perhaps with a couple of questions that we didn't come to. Thank you so much, Perry, for speaking today, and thank you everyone for coming and asking such thoughtful questions. If you have any thoughts or feedback from the sessions, we'd really love to hear it in the chat box today, or you can email me after the event at megan@restlessdevelopment.org. This was the last one of our Becoming Restless Changing Development webinars, and it's been a real pleasure to connect with so many of you virtually over the last few weeks. So thank you so much for being part of this to hear more about our journey. I hope you've been inspired by all of our wonderful speakers, and I hope to be in touch again with many of you as you join the next chapter of our journey as a supporter. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming.